Okay, like I said here, we're going to pick out one tribe, the Sioux tribe, and kind of use their story to represent what's happening out on the Great Plains during the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. If you look down at the bottom of this timeline where you see those thin red dashes, those represent the different wars against the Sioux tribe. So here's just one map that represents the land of the Sioux in the 1850s. And of course, remember, there are no strict borders. The neighboring tribes who are friends and the neighboring tribes who are enemies often have overlapping land with the Sioux. Anyway, as Americans started to rush west in the gold rush after the completion of Manifest Destiny in 1848, conflict with the tribes who lived in the northern plains was pretty much a guarantee. So, to avoid a big war, the United States and 8 tribes, including the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Arapaho, the Arikara, and some others, they all signed an agreement in the 1850s not to have a war. The tribes agreed not to attack people, Americans, who were moving through their land to the west, and the tribes were going to get $50,000 per year for the next 50 years from the US government. The Sioux in this agreement were given permanent and exclusive ownership over the sacred Black Hills that you see there in the center of the map, land they had been fighting with over the Cheyenne for generations. Either way, now, for about a decade or a little over a decade, there's relative peace on the frontier. Americans are still moving west, but the agreement is held. But in 1864, as the Civil War comes to an end, American settlers began taking a new shortcut to the west coast to avoid that long Oregon Trail. This new Bozeman Trail that you see in red cut through Crow territory mostly, but the Crow tribe had agreed to the construction. The neighboring Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho considered this Bozeman Trail to be a direct threat to their future. If you look at this line, you can see that Bozeman Trail in pink barely, but does cut right through Sioux territory. So in Red Cloud's war, the tribes in this area, the Sioux tribes in this area, united and managed to actually wipe out over 80 American soldiers in what's called the Fetterman Fight or the Fetterman Massacre. That war, Red Cloud's War, had resulted from the tribes killing only about 40 or 50 people that had moved along the Bozeman Trail. Then the U.S. Army was set out there to defeat them, and Red Cloud's army won such a major victory at the Fetterman Fight or Fetterman Massacre that the U.S. government actually agreed to sign a treaty that we didn't like. I think this is the only time in the 100 years of the Indian Wars where a Native American tribe forced us to sign a treaty that we really didn't want to sign. And that treaty gave the Sioux permanent control over all the land that you see here. This was supposed to be the Great Sioux Reservation. Starting in 1868, this is just 3 years after the Civil War, the U.S. government agreed that they would punish and arrest any settlers who attempted to move onto Sioux land. And the Sioux agreed that they would never attack Americans who simply just marched through the land on the way to the West. But of course, things are not going to stay peaceful for that long there, right? There are no American cities or American jails or police or, courts out there. And so Americans start illegally moving on to the Great Sioux Reservation in search of animals to hunt or in search of gold. And of course, gold is eventually discovered. In 17, no, I'm sorry, in 1877, right about the time that Reconstruction comes to an end in the South, gold is discovered on the Sioux land in the Black Hills that you see down there. Now, when gold is discovered in the Black Hills, Americans instantly illegally flood into the area in large numbers. The American government doesn't really go out there and stop them like they'd agreed to. And so Sioux warriors rise up to defend these sacred lands around the Black Hills, resulting in what we called the Great Sioux War, the big one. Now, famously, here, probably the most famous part of the entire war is that Custer, the American leader, leads about 200 of his men into a total massacre where they're all wiped out in the worst defeat for the U.S. Army in any of the Indian Wars. But the army bounced back just a couple of months after that and ended up totally crushing the Sioux tribes in the Great Sioux War. And after that, the tribes were forced to surrender all of that land that you see near the Black Hills that is shaded. They used to have this according to the 1868 treaty. And then about a decade later, they lost all that land. Now, a little bit later, about another decade later, there's a new treaty signed that allows the tribal land to be divided up into equal sized chunks for each family. And it also allows the families to sell their chunk of land for profit. And that allows, or I should say, results in large portions of the Great Sioux Reservation being sold off by desperate families who are looking to escape poverty here. And so when I go to the next slide, you can see how much of that land ends up getting sold. Not all of it, but a big chunk of land again is lost. And so now we see the current boundaries of the Sioux reservations that are left over from the Great Sioux Reservation that was originally shaped like that. So if you want to go back and do a little review, that is a famous story of what happens with the Sioux tribe. In dark green on this map, you can see the land that the Sioux used to originally inhabit before Europeans or Americans showed up. And remember, those are not strict borders. The surrounding tribes that you see there, like the Pawnee or the Iowa or the Mandan or the Cheyenne, also live there. But skipping all that complex stuff, what you see in orange are the reservations that these tribes now live on. And here's some more maps that you can check out. You can pause on and kind of see the land that they used to live on compared to the land that is left over. Pause and check it out if you want to. An extremely similar situation going on right here. I'll allow you to check that out in detail if you want to. But realistically, just a couple more quick but very important details. In the 1880s, Congress passed a law that divided each of the tribe's land, like I said, into equal pieces. This didn't just happen with the Sioux, it happened with all tribes. It divides the tribe's land into equal pieces that will now be owned by individual families instead of collectively owned by the whole tribe. And now that individuals own their land as private property, they can sell it to the American government or other people. And a lot of families in poverty did that. Over about half the land that the tribes had in 1887 was sold over the next 45 years or so before this type of land selling became illegal. Now, famously, and to finish things off here, what happens with a lot of this new open land is that the land sold by Native American tribes combined with a bunch of other unclaimed land out in the West is literally given away for free in what we call the land rushes. Literally, it's just what it sounds like. Anyone involved in this race will get a large free chunk of land as long as they register for the race and follow all the rules of the race. This is its own story that I can get into if you want to, but we're just kind of talking about what happens with this land that hasn't been claimed by anyone and that has recently been sold by Native Americans thanks to the Dawes Act. So now you've got a little summary of the century of the Indian Wars, some specifics about the Sioux tribe, the Dawes Act further dividing up tribal lands, and the famous announcement by the federal government in 1890 that the frontier was closed. The Wild West had been won, at least from the perspective of the Americans at the time. And that kind of takes us through what's happening with this aspect of American history during and after Reconstruction. The Indian Wars are over in our story, but the stories and experiences of Native Americans in our country's history are not over. A lot of those other events are coming up later in our story. I hope you're going to bring me some questions or comments. And if any random people out there find this thing on YouTube, you can just hold your criticisms, man. I'm not a historian, and you get what you pay for. I record this thing in under 10 minutes for free at home. Hopefully, it's useful for someone. Thanks.